My son pulled a cruel prank on a girl, so I took his new car, phone, and canceled his 18th birthday party, then gave the car to my stepdaughter. His dad showed up laughing on his birthday, high-fived him, and drove him to New York. He's ghosted me ever since. I am 48 and I have a son, Jack. He is 19 and a daughter, Alyssa, 18, and am married to Tom, 50. Tom is Alyssa's father, but Jack's father is my ex-husband Dan, 48. Dan and I had a pretty ugly custody fight, and he lives in New York while we live in Texas. Over the years, Dan has unsuccessfully tried to get Jack to move in with him. It wasn't easy to fight him off since he is a very successful lawyer. Jack is a pretty popular kid in school. His friends on the wrestling team came up with a prank for him to ask a heavily autistic girl who had a crush on him to the prom as a joke and for him to show up wearing a gorilla suit. Jack originally said no, but the wrestling team actually raised a fund which got to be somewhat worth of $800 for him to do it, and they paid for the gorilla suit. Jack agreed. If it matters, this is very out of character for him. After the prom, I was looking around on Instagram and saw pictures of him in the gorilla suit and was surprised that he didn't take his girlfriend Jess. After reading the comments, I learned what happened. To say I was furious doesn't even do it justice. I woke Jack up as soon as I saw it and screamed at him until my lungs gave out. Then when Tom heard what was going on, he joined in. Tom and Jack have never gotten along. I can't prove it, but I suspect Jack's father Dan has a hand in that. Jack told Tom, "F off, I'm talking to my mother." So, we took away all of Jack's electronics, his phone, and we had paid for a car for his graduation present. Because of his prank and disrespect to Tom, we instead gave it to Alyssa. We also forced him to give us the $800 plus, and we gave it to the girl and made him write a letter of apology. He was also grounded for a month, and we canceled his 18th birthday party. When Jack's birthday came, there was a knock at the door. It was Dan, and he had suitcases. Tom said, "What is this? The custody agreement says you don't get him on this birthday?" Dan just looked past Tom and said, "Hey kid, I'm here for the jailbreak." He then pointed at a Mustang and said, "Hope you like Fords. You can practice driving your new car on a road trip back to New York. Let's take a detour to NOLA, New Orleans." The two of them were laughing, high-fiving, and backslapping, and they just ignored us as we tried to intervene. The only time Dan acknowledged me was to look me in the eye and say, as cold as ice, "Checkmate." And for Jack to yell as they were driving off, "F off, Tom." Since then, Jack has gone totally no contact with me. He talks a little bit to Alyssa, and from the little he does tell her, he's doing well, and Dan is giving him the royal treatment, bringing him to steak houses, Yankees games, and just giving him outright cash. It has been almost a year, and I'm going crazy thinking I've lost my son. So, am I the asshole? Edit. I see there is a little confusion here about whether Alyssa is my bio daughter or stepdaughter. She is my stepdaughter. We really have a mother-daughter relationship to the point where it doesn't even occur to me to call her my step. At the risk of understatement, Jack never warmed to Tom the same way. Best comments. Opie answered a couple of questions that gave us more information about the son's hatred toward the stepfather, providing a clearer picture of the messy situation. Would you be willing to leave Tom if it meant a second chance with Jack? Realistically, Jack is never going to spend another minute under Tom's roof or share holidays or include him at graduation, etc. If I had to, yes. Truthfully, that's kind of been falling apart anyway, and the only reason I haven't divorced him is because I don't want to lose Alyssa. When you took away your son's phone as punishment, you expected that to also apply to his father. You chose to have a child with Dan and to co-parent. Cutting communication between them is poisonous. I didn't get into that detail, but there are court-ordered video calls every Wednesday and Sunday. I used my phone for those and couldn't take those away even if I wanted to unless I wanted to get sued again. But I did forbid Jack from talking about this with Dan because I didn't trust what Dan would do with it. I just thought maybe he'd use it to drive a wedge, but I never dreamed he'd roll up and drive off with my son. Seriously, of course Jack is going to resent Tom under all of these circumstances. Dan may be a total and complete ass. We don't really know. What we do know is that Tom did nothing to earn Jack's respect, and OP is acting like the victim for what amounts to a ridiculous, overbearing amount of control that she tried to place between Dan and Jack. Teenagers who are overly controlled do stupid things like the very cruel stunt that Jack pulled because they get zero respect from the people who are supposed to be guiding them. I have spent a lot of time in therapy and have done a lot of introspection since losing Jack. It is true that I totally mismanaged things with his father. I'll even admit that Dan has very good reason to hate my guts. I wish I shared custody better, and if I did and managed to make some kind of peace with Dan, this would have never happened. Did you let Tom come right in and start disciplining your son, or did you take the lead? I tried to introduce Tom slowly, and things started out okay. They were never warm, but it was peaceful. Things started getting rougher when Tom moved in. He had an accident at work and got behind on bills, so he moved in. It was a little sooner than we would have liked, but Jack had known him for a year at that point. It started with little things, like Tom telling Jack to clean his room, or put away his plates, or mow the lawn. When Jack was 16, there was one time that Tom's back was hurting, and he told Jack to warm him up a plate of leftovers, and Jack was playing a game and told him to get it himself. Tom unplugged his Xbox, and then Jack said, "This effing guy. He stays here for free, eats free food, and now even thinks he has a butler. This isn't an effing hotel, Tom." Well, to be honest, if Tom can get up to unplug an Xbox, he can go warm a plate. The more you reply, the more obvious it was a Tom problem rather than a Dan problem, and it's obvious no matter on what you think of Don character and person, that Jack will go to the person who, in his words, doesn't treat him like a butler. Were things this contentious between you and Dan before Tom entered the picture? The end of the marriage wasn't pretty. I have to take responsibility for that, and the divorce was very contentious. Following that, there was a lot of bad blood, but it definitely got worse once Tom entered the picture. Tom once made a Facebook joke about how he wishes they would bring back paddling in schools. To say Dan went nuts does not cover it. He literally got on a plane immediately from New York, busted into my house, and started making all kinds of accusations and threats against Tom. Tom had to literally lock himself in the bathroom and escape out the window because we all thought Dan was going to do something crazy. Following that, I had to spend the next 2 years in litigation proving that Tom never has and never will lay a hand on Jack. Jack has also been rubbing it in Tom's face that has his father's permission to defend himself against Tom if he ever wants to get old-fashioned with him. Jack is a 6 feet 2 inches wrestling champion and MMA hobbyist. Tom is a 50-year-old man with a bad back half his size, and they are both keenly aware of it. If Tom ever laid a hand on Jack, I'd see to it that he'd be in jail. But I suspect his first stop from any such encounter would be the trauma ward. At least Dan is a good guy, not like Tom, who makes jokes about child abuse. I agree. It was the first time I ever seriously considered kicking Tom out, and came pretty damn close to it. Also, seeing Tom lock himself in the bathroom and climb out the window deeply hurt his pride. Jack would taunt him mercilessly for that, and would even refer to himself as the only man in the house right in front of Tom. Even when Tom was yelling at him over the prank, Jack told him, "You'd better watch your tone. That window's locked." Here you're saying that Tom moved in with you earlier than you would have planned, because he needed somewhere to live. And then he started throwing his weight around as an adult and traditional male authority figure when he wasn't even a contributing member of the household. There's nothing in that for Jack to respect. From his perspective, you brought in a charity case who orders him around, you sacrificed his comfort for Tom, and Tom wasn't even grateful to him, but instead expected obedience. And you let it keep going, keep progressing. All while your financial plans for both you and Tom relied on the child support for Jack, even relying on it continuing to come in and not being spent on Jack, after Jack would be at college. I expect Jack leaving was a long time coming and already planned. University acceptances don't just materialize after prom, not without applying before, and his girlfriend was already going to New York. He may even agree to that cruel stunt because he was leaving anyway. I don't know why you thought he was sticking around, even though he didn't let you know he was leaving. He didn't have much to stay for. It sounds like he's happier now, though who knows about his ethics. But you set fire to whatever bridge there might have been between you. Update number 1. On the advice of some of the posters, I reached out to Dan to see if he'd be willing to consider brokering peace between me and Jack. About a week later, I got a response telling me to meet him and Jack at a cafe in Manhattan. He arranged a 6 a.m. flight and put me in a dodgy hotel in probably the most dangerous neighborhood in New York. I arrived and saw Dan, Jack's girlfriend Jess, and his friend from a past firm, Jonathan. I noticed Jess had an engagement ring on her finger. Jonathan said Jack has a claim against me for stealing the $840, and until that is resolved, I am not to contact him, but to only contact Jonathan. I told Jonathan that's the money his friends paid him for the prank and that I gave to the girl. Jonathan said he was aware of the circumstances, but nonetheless it wasn't my money and under the law, it was a theft and Jack has a legal claim against me. I said don't care if it was against the law, Jack had no right to that money, and they can sue me if they wanted. Jack said, "You locked me up in my room like a prisoner for a month, took the car bought for me with Dad's child support money, took the money and berated me for hours on end. Unless you're going to give me the car, this is the only thing you can undo. You said you wished we could have handled it better, so here is your chance." Or was that just bullshit lip service? I told him I was sorry, but I can't do it. Jonathan then gave me a cease and desist letter telling me to not contact Jack and to address all communication to Jonathan. Then Jack and Jess left, and I asked Dan if he could talk for a minute. I asked him if he brought me there to humiliate me, and he said actually no, he didn't. He brought me so I could humiliate myself. He'd actually worked very hard to get Jack to the point where he'd be open to talking to me again if I were willing to back down just a little. But since he knew that if I had to choose between my indignation and my own son, that I'd choose my indignation every time, just like I did in our marriage. I asked him why he'd put us all through that. He said it was because a part of him wondered if I'd ever learn to pick love over anger. He bet his future that I wouldn't when he divorced me. So he had to see for himself how it actually turned out after all these years later. I asked him if Jack was just a pawn in his game. He said no, if I actually would have picked Jack, he'd be with me now and there would have been nothing anyone could have done to stop it. But instead, my indignation over a stranger was more important to me than learning to move on with my own son. I asked him what about the girl. He then said, "I hope she'll be a wonderful daughter to you, since you lost a son for her." I told her, I don't know the girl. So, then he said, "Sounds like a bad trade," and left. Also, I'm apparently not invited to Jack's wedding. Best comments. This is way beyond Reddit's pay grade. You all suck. Except for Alyssa and the girl. You allowed your husband to abuse your son. Your son didn't become an asshole overnight. And you suck doubly for pitching a temper tantrum after you lost your asshole son because you were more worried about your indignation. Overall, I think you, Jack, and Tom need to stay away from each other, and you need to return your son's money. Be happy with your abusive husband and leave Jack alone. You all F up.